The wind howled across the barren plains of Nebraska Territory as Faith O'Malley clutched her worn leather satchel to her chest, her knuckles white with apprehension. The year was 1867, and the railway station at Kierney stood before her like a lonely outpost against the vast wilderness. Her journey from Boston had been long and fraught with uncertainty, but nothing had prepared her for what awaited her at the end of the line. "Last stop, Kierney," bellowed the conductor as the steam engine hissed and groaned to a halt. Faith descended from the train car, her simple blue calico dress billowing around her ankles. At 22, she had never ventured beyond the confines of her childhood home in Boston until now. The advertisement had been simple: "Successful rancher seeks bride of good character. Passage paid." It had been her ticket out of destitution after her parents' passing left her with nothing but debts and painful memories. As passengers disembarked around her, Faith scanned the platform for the man who was to be her husband, one Harrison Caldwell, a cattle baron who had made his fortune in the Nebraska Territory. There had been correspondence, of course, but she had never seen his face. Now, as the platform emptied, a cold dread settled in her stomach. Had he forgotten? Or worse, changed his mind? The platform had nearly emptied when Faith noticed a man slumped against a wooden bench at the far end of the station. He was well dressed in a fine black coat with boots that spoke of wealth, but something was terribly wrong. His face was pale as parchment, and a dark stain was spreading across his vest. Faith approached cautiously. "Sir, are you quite all right?" The man's eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes as blue as the summer sky. "Miss O'Malley," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the howling prairie wind. "Yes," she replied, startled. "How did you Harrison Caldwell?" he managed, a pained smile crossing his face. "Not exactly the reception I had planned for my bride-to-be." Faith's heart thundered in her chest as she realized who this man was. "You're wounded," she exclaimed, dropping to her knees beside him. Up close, she could see that the stain on his vest was blood, far too much blood. "Ambushed." "On the way here," he explained between labored breaths. "They took my horse, left me for dead." Faith's mind raced. She had come all this way to marry this man, and now he was bleeding to death before they had even exchanged proper greetings. "We need to get you to a doctor," she said firmly. Harrison shook his head weakly. "No doctor in town today. My ranch, 6 miles north. My foreman would know what to do." 6 miles, Faith repeated incredulously. "But you can't possibly walk in this condition." "Then I suppose this is where we part ways," Harrison murmured, his eyes drifting closed. "Sorry to have wasted your time, Miss O'Malley." Something fierce and determined stirred in Faith's chest. She had not traveled nearly 2,000 miles to be defeated now. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice stronger than she felt, "I did not come all this way to be a widow before I'm even a wife. You're coming with me." Harrison's eyes opened again, surprise evident in their blue depths. "I don't think you understand the gravity." "I understand perfectly well," Faith interrupted, already removing her shawl to press against his wound. "Now, can you stand if I support you?" With considerable effort and Harrison's pained gasps, Faith managed to get him upright. His tall frame towered over her petite one, but she positioned herself under his arm, bearing as much of his weight as she could. The station master, finally noticing their predicament, hurried over. "Miss, what in tarnation are you doing with Mr. Caldwell?" "I'm taking him home," Faith declared, her jaw set in determination. "Is there a wagon I might hire?" The station master scratched his grizzled beard. "Old Pete might lend his cart, but it'll cost you." Faith reached into her reticule and extracted a few precious coins, nearly the last of her money. "Will this suffice?" Within the hour, Faith found herself driving a rickety wagon north along a rutted dirt road, with Harrison laid out in the back, drifting in and out of consciousness. The sun beat down mercilessly, and dust coated her throat, but Faith pressed on, following Harrison's intermittent directions. "Left at the Split Oak," he mumbled at one point, his voice barely audible over the creaking of the wagon wheels. "Hold on, Mr. Caldwell," Faith urged, glancing back at his pale face. "Just hold on." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, a sprawling ranch came into view. Unlike the modest homesteads Faith had passed along the way, this property boasted a handsome two-story house, several outbuildings, and vast stretches of fenced land, dotted with cattle. As the wagon approached, a man emerged from one of the outbuildings, his hand hovering near the pistol at his hip. When he recognized the wagon's occupant, however, he broke into a run. "Mr. Caldwell, sweet Jesus, what happened?" The man, weathered and lean with a thick mustache, helped Faith bring the wagon to a stop. "He was ambushed," Faith explained quickly. "He's lost a great deal of blood." The man, who introduced himself as Frank, the ranch foreman, wasted no time in calling for help. Soon, several cowhands appeared, and together they carried Harrison into the house, with Faith following close behind. The interior of the Caldwell home was as impressive as its exterior: polished wood floors, tasteful furnishings, and evidence of prosperity everywhere Faith looked. But she had little time to admire her surroundings as she followed the men upstairs to what appeared to be Harrison's bedroom. "Someone ride for Doc Simmons in Platte City," Frank ordered, and one of the younger cowhands immediately departed. Faith stood by anxiously as they laid Harrison on his bed. "I need hot water, clean cloths, and whiskey," she announced, removing her gloves. Frank raised an eyebrow. "Beggin' your pardon, miss, but who exactly are you?" "Faith O'Malley," she replied, already rolling up her sleeves. "Mr. Caldwell's mail-order bride." A look of understanding crossed Frank's weathered face. "Well, I'll be damned. He was supposed to meet you today." He nodded to one of the other men. "Get the lady what she needs." For the next several hours, Faith worked tirelessly to clean and dress Harrison's wound, a deep gash in his left side that had narrowly missed vital organs, by her estimation. Her mother had been a midwife in Boston, and Faith had assisted her enough times to know the basics of wound care. Night had fallen by the time Dr. Simmons arrived, a gruff older man who seemed surprised to find his patient still alive. "You've done good work, Miss O'Malley," he remarked after examining Harrison. "Another hour without attention and he'd have bled out for certain. Will he recover?" Faith asked, her voice small in the quiet room. The doctor sighed heavily. "Hard to say. He's young and strong, which works in his favor, but he's lost a lot of blood and infection is always a risk." He handed Faith a small brown bottle. "Laudanum for the pain. 2 drops every 4 hours, no more. And keep the wound clean." After the doctor departed, Frank showed Faith to a guest room, but she insisted on staying by Harrison's bedside. As the night deepened and the ranch grew quiet, Faith found herself studying the face of the man she had come to marry. Harrison Caldwell was handsome. There was no denying that strong jaw, straight nose, and thick brown hair that curled slightly at the temples. Even in his weakened state, there was an air of strength about him. Faith wondered what kind of husband he would have made, what kind he might still make if he survived. "You must live, Mr. Caldwell," she whispered in the darkened room. "I've come too far to lose you now." The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity as Faith divided her time between nursing Harrison and learning the workings of the ranch. Frank proved an invaluable ally, explaining the operations of the cattle business while keeping the cowhands in line. To her surprise, Faith found herself adapting quickly to ranch life, her natural practicality serving her well in the unfamiliar environment. Harrison drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to answer questions, other times lost in fever dreams. On the 4th night, as Faith was bathing his forehead with cool water, his eyes opened with newfound clarity. "You're still here," he murmured, his voice raspy but stronger than it had been. "Where else would I be?" Faith replied, setting aside the cloth. "Most women would have fled back east by now," Harrison said, attempting to sit up before wincing in pain. Faith gently pressed him back down. "I'm not most women, Mr. Caldwell." A ghost of a smile played across Harrison's lips. "No, I can see that you're not." He studied her face in the lamplight. "You look different from your photograph." Faith blushed slightly. The photograph she had sent had been taken 3 years earlier, before hardship had etched itself into her features. "I hope you're not disappointed." "On the contrary," Harrison replied. The photograph didn't do you justice. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Frank entered, his expression grim. "Sorry to disturb you, but there's something you both should know," he said, twisting his hat in his hands. "Word in town is that the Blackburn gang is claiming responsibility for the attack on Mr. Caldwell. They're saying it's just the beginning." Harrison's jaw tightened. "Blackburn, I should have known." "Who is Blackburn?" Faith asked, looking between the two men. "Victor Blackburn," Harrison explained, his voice hardening. "He owns the neighboring ranch to the east. We've been at odds ever since I refused to sell him water rights to Silver Creek last year." "He's a dangerous man," Frank added, "and he's got at least 6 hired guns riding with him now." Harrison attempted to rise again, grimacing with the effort. "We need to prepare. The men should be armed. What you need to do is rest," Faith interrupted firmly. "You're in no condition to face anyone." Harrison looked ready to argue, but Frank nodded in agreement with Faith. "Miss O'Malley's right, boss. You focus on healing. The boys and I will keep an eye out." After Frank departed, Harrison turned his gaze to Faith. "You should know what you've gotten yourself into, Miss O'Malley. This territory can be lawless at times." "The marshal in Kierney is in Blackburn's pocket, and the nearest honest lawman is 2 days' ride away." Faith squared her shoulders. "I'm not afraid, Mr. Caldwell." Harrison studied her face for a long moment. "No, I don't believe you are, but perhaps you should be." The following week brought improvement to Harrison's condition. The wound began to heal cleanly and his strength returned gradually. Faith continued to care for him, and as they spent time together, their formal addresses gave way to Harrison and Faith. She learned that he had come west as a young man of 18, working as a cowhand, before saving enough to buy his first small herd. 10 years of hard work and shrewd business sense had transformed that modest beginning into one of the largest cattle operations in the Nebraska Territory. For his part, Harrison discovered that Faith was not only beautiful but intelligent and resourceful. She had been educated at a respectable girls' school in Boston before her father's investments failed, leaving the family destitute. When both parents succumbed to influenza the previous winter, Faith had been left with few options. "Why a mail-order bride?" Harrison asked one evening as they shared supper in his room, Faith having insisted he was well enough to sit up for meals. "A woman like you could have found a husband in Boston." Faith's fingers tightened around her fork. "The suitors who came calling after my parents' deaths weren't interested in me, only in my father's business connections. When those proved worthless, they disappeared." She lifted her chin. "I decided if I was to marry a stranger, it would be on my terms in a place where I could make a fresh start." Harrison nodded slowly. "And now, do you regret your decision?" Faith considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "Despite everything, I don't regret coming here." A smile spread across Harrison's face, the first genuine smile Faith had seen from him. "I'm glad to hear it." As Harrison's recovery progressed, tension mounted around the ranch. Frank doubled the guards patrolling the property's boundaries, and the hands took to carrying rifles even when performing routine chores. Faith found herself watching the horizon anxiously whenever she ventured outside. 10 days after her arrival in Kierney, Faith was hanging laundry in the yard when she noticed a cloud of dust approaching from the east. She shaded her eyes, her heart racing as she made out a group of riders. "Frank," she called out, and the foreman emerged from the barn, rifle in hand. "Get inside, Miss Faith," he ordered, his voice tense. "And tell the boys to ready themselves." Faith hurried to comply, warning the cook and housekeeper before making her way upstairs to Harrison, who was now able to move about his room unaided. "Riders coming," she reported breathlessly. "Frank thinks it might be Blackburn." Harrison's expression darkened as he reached for the gun belt hanging on his bedpost. "Help me downstairs." "Harrison, you're not fully healed. I will not hide in my bedroom while my ranch is threatened," he said firmly, buckling the belt around his waist. "Now will you help me, or shall I make my way down alone?" Reluctantly, Faith offered her arm for support, and together they descended to the first floor. By the time they reached the front porch, the riders had pulled up in the yard. 7 men sat astride dust-covered horses, their faces hard beneath the brims of their hats. At their center was a tall man with silver threading through his dark hair and beard. Victor Blackburn, Faith presumed. "Caldwell," Blackburn called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "I see you survived our last meeting. Pity." Harrison stepped forward, one hand resting casually on his pistol. Faith noticed he stood straighter, masking any sign of weakness. "State your business and be on your way, Blackburn," the older man smirked. "Just paying a neighborly visit." "Heard you had a woman living here now." His gaze shifted to Faith, and she felt a chill run down her spine at the coldness in his eyes. "Quite a pretty little thing, isn't she?" Harrison moved slightly, positioning himself between Faith and Blackburn's line of sight. "My patience is wearing thin." Blackburn's smirk faded. "I'll be direct then. I want Silver Creek, Caldwell. My offer still stands $5,000. "The creek isn't for sale," Harrison replied evenly. "Not at any price." Blackburn's jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake. Water is more precious than gold out here, and I won't be denied what my cattle need." "Your cattle would do fine if you hadn't overgrazed your southern pastures," Harrison countered. "Your poor management isn't my problem." For a tense moment, Faith thought Blackburn might order his men to attack then and there. Instead, he reined his horse around. "This isn't over, Caldwell. One way or another, that creek will be mine." As the riders departed, Faith released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Harrison turned to her, his face grim. "I'm sorry you had to witness that. Is he truly dangerous?" Faith asked, watching the dust cloud recede. Harrison nodded slowly. "Blackburn doesn't make idle threats. He's killed men for less than a water dispute." He sighed heavily. "Perhaps it would be best if you returned east, Faith." "I can arrange passage." "Absolutely not," Faith interrupted, indignation flaring in her chest. "I didn't nurse you back from the brink of death just to abandon you at the first sign of trouble." Harrison's expression softened, and he reached out to take her hand. "You're a remarkable woman, Faith O'Malley." The warmth of his touch sent a flutter through her chest. "And you, Harrison Caldwell, are a stubborn man who needs to rest before you tear your stitches." He laughed then, a rich sound that transformed his face. "Yes, madam." That evening, after Harrison had retired to his room, Faith sat with Frank on the back porch, watching the sun set over the vast expanse of prairie. "How bad is this situation with Blackburn, truly?" she asked, voicing the question that had been troubling her all afternoon. Frank took a long draw from his pipe before answering. "Bad enough. Blackburn's got the marshal in his pocket, as Mr. Caldwell said, and he's not known for his patience." "What about the water rights?" "Is Silver Creek really so valuable?" "It's the only year-round water source for miles," Frank explained. "Without it, this ranch would be worth half what it is now, and with the drought we've been having, Blackburn's desperate." Faith considered this information. "There must be a solution that doesn't involve bloodshed." Frank gave her a sidelong glance. "You got any ideas, Miss Faith?" She didn't, not yet. But as she bid Frank good night and made her way back inside, Faith's mind was whirring with possibilities. The following day, while Harrison was resting, Faith asked Frank to show her the property boundaries in Silver Creek. They rode out mid-morning, Faith somewhat uncomfortable but determined to stride one of the gentler mares from the stable. Silver Creek was indeed impressive, a clear, swift-running stream that cut through the eastern portion of Harrison's land. Frank explained that it originated in the hills to the north and continued south beyond Blackburn's property. "Mr. Caldwell's grandfather homesteaded this land specifically for the creek," Frank explained as they dismounted to let the horses drink. "Built the first cabin right over there." He pointed to a clearing where the foundation stones of a structure were still visible. Faith walked along the bank, noting how the creek widened in some places and narrowed in others. "Has Harrison considered selling water rights to part of the creek?" she asked. "Not ownership of the land, but access to the water." Frank scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Can't say that's come up. Mr. Caldwell and Blackburn have been at each other's throats for so long, I don't think either of them has considered a middle ground." "Would such an arrangement be possible?" Faith pressed. "I suppose it might," Frank allowed. "But getting those two to agree on anything would take a miracle." Faith smiled. "My mother always said that faith could move mountains. Perhaps it can bridge creeks as well." Upon returning to the ranch, Faith was surprised to find Harrison up and dressed, reviewing ledgers in his study. He looked up as she entered, his expression brightening. "Frank took you riding?" he asked, noting her attire. "He showed me Silver Creek," Faith replied, taking a seat opposite him. "It's beautiful country you have, Harrison." "It is," he agreed, his pride evident. "My grandfather chose well when he settled here." Faith gathered her courage. "I've been thinking about the situation with Blackburn." Harrison's expression immediately sobered. "That's not your concern, Faith, isn't it?" she challenged gently. "If I am to be your wife, your concerns are mine as well." The words hung between them, laden with meaning. They had not spoken directly of marriage since Harrison's recovery began, both seemingly content to exist in this undefined space between strangers and betrothed. Harrison closed his ledger slowly. "What were you thinking?" Faith outlined her idea, a legal agreement allowing Blackburn limited water rights to a portion of Silver Creek in exchange for a fair price and a cessation of hostilities. "He gets what his cattle need most, and you retain ownership and control of the creek," she concluded. "It seems a reasonable compromise." Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "Blackburn isn't a reasonable man." "Perhaps not," Faith acknowledged, "but is protecting your pride worth risking your life, or the lives of your men?" A flash of irritation crossed Harrison's features. "This isn't about pride, isn't it? At least partly," Faith pressed. "I'm not suggesting you surrender, Harrison. I'm suggesting you negotiate from a position of strength on your terms before this conflict escalates further." Harrison was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured. "I'll consider it, but I make no promises." Faith knew that was the best she could hope for, given his stubborn nature. She rose to leave, but Harrison caught her hand, keeping her in place. "Thank you," he said softly, "for caring enough to speak your mind." The sincerity in his eyes made Faith's heart skip a beat. "That's what partners do, isn't it?" His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, sending warmth up her arm. "Is that what we are, partners?" Faith swallowed, suddenly aware of how alone they were in the study, how close he was standing. "I'd like us to be." Harrison's gaze dropped to her lips, and for a breathless moment, Faith thought he might kiss her. Instead, he released her hand and stepped back. "I have some things to attend to." "We'll talk more at supper." Faith nodded, trying to hide her disappointment as she left the study. She reminded herself that they still barely knew each other. Whatever was growing between them needed time. That evening, as promised, Harrison broached the subject again over supper. "I've been thinking about your proposal regarding Silver Creek," he began, setting down his fork. "You make a compelling case." Faith tried not to appear too eager. "You'll consider negotiating with Blackburn?" "I'll do more than consider it," Harrison replied. "I've asked Frank to deliver a message to Blackburn, proposing a meeting in town day after tomorrow with the banker as witness." Relief washed over Faith. "That's wonderful news." Harrison's expression remained serious. "Don't celebrate yet. Blackburn may refuse, or he may try to turn the meeting to his advantage. But it's a start," Faith insisted. "A chance for peace." Harrison's features softened as he regarded her across the table. "Your optimism is refreshing, if somewhat at odds with the realities of the Nebraska Territory." "Someone has to believe in better possibilities," Faith replied with a smile. "Otherwise, what's the point of building a life out here?" Something in Harrison's expression shifted, a vulnerability appearing behind his usual reserve. "Is that what you want, Faith, a life out here?" The question caught her off guard. I think I could be happy here, she answered honestly. The land has its own kind of beauty and the people have been kind for the most part. And what about us? Harrison asked quietly. Could you be happy as my wife? Faith's heart raced. We've known each other such a short time, she said carefully. That's true, Harrison acknowledged. But I feel I know your character, Faith O'Malley. You're brave, intelligent, and compassionate. When most women would have fled at the first sign of trouble, you stayed and fought for my life, for this ranch, even for peace with my enemies. He reached across the table to take her hand. I won't rush you. If you need more time before we formalize our arrangement, I understand. But I want you to know that I would be honored to have you as my wife. Tears pricked at Faith's eyes. It wasn't the romantic proposal she might have dreamed of as a girl, but there was something deeply moving about Harrison's straightforward honesty. I would be honored as well, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But perhaps we should see this business with Blackburn settled first. Harrison nodded, squeezing her hand gently. Agreed, one challenge at a time. The following day was filled with preparations for the meeting with Blackburn. Harrison spent hours with his lawyer, a shrewd older man named Peterson who rode out from Kierney at Harrison's request. Together, they drafted a formal agreement outlining the proposed water rights arrangement. Faith, meanwhile, found herself increasingly absorbed in the workings of the ranch. The housekeeper, Mrs. Bell, had begun teaching her the particulars of managing such a large household, while Frank continued to explain the cattle business. Faith discovered she had a natural aptitude for organization and was soon helping Harrison sort through correspondence and invoices that had accumulated during his convalescence. You have a head for figures, Harrison remarked as they worked together in his study. Better than mine, I dare say. Faith smiled, pleased by the compliment. My father insisted I learn bookkeeping. He said a woman should always understand her family's finances. A wise man, Harrison replied. Too many wives are kept ignorant of such matters, only to find themselves helpless if widowed. The comment sobered Faith, reminding her how close she had come to exactly that fate. Let's ensure that doesn't happen anytime soon, she said softly. Harrison's hand covered hers on the desk. I intend to live a good long while, Faith, especially now that I have someone to live for. Their eyes met, and Faith felt the now familiar flutter in her chest. Each day, it seemed, brought them closer, building a foundation of mutual respect and growing affection. The morning of the meeting dawned clear and cool, a welcome respite from the summer heat. Faith helped Harrison dress in his finest suit, noting with relief that he moved with almost his usual vigor. The wound was healing well, though he still tired more easily than before. You don't have to come, Harrison said as they prepared to depart for town. This could turn unpleasant. Faith shook her head firmly. I'll be at your side, Harrison. They rode into Kierney together, Frank and two other hands accompanying them as a precaution. The town was busier than Faith remembered from her arrival, with wagons and riders crowding the main street. The bank where the meeting was to take place stood at the north end of town, an imposing brick building that spoke of the area's growing prosperity. Inside, they were greeted by Mr. Winters, the banker, a portly man with mutton chop whiskers and a nervous demeanor. Mr. Caldwell, Miss O'Malley, he said, ushering them into a private office at the rear of the building. Mr. Blackburn has not yet arrived. Harrison checked his pocket watch. We're early yet, he'll come. True to Harrison's prediction, Victor Blackburn arrived precisely at the appointed hour, accompanied by a thin man in a dusty black suit whom he introduced as his lawyer. If Blackburn was surprised to see Faith present, he hid it well, merely inclining his head in a cursory greeting. Mr. Winters took his place at the head of the table, with Harrison and Faith seated on one side, Blackburn and his lawyer on the other. Frank remained standing by the door, his hand never straying far from his holstered pistol. Gentlemen, Winters began, we're here to discuss a potential agreement regarding water rights to Silver Creek. Mr. Caldwell has prepared a proposal for Mr. Blackburn's consideration. Harrison slid a document across the table. Access to the eastern bend of the creek for your cattle, Blackburn. Legal, documented rights that can't be revoked, so long as you abide by the terms. Blackburn's eyes narrowed as he scanned the document. And what are those terms? An annual payment of $500, Harrison replied. No damming or diversion of the water. Access limited to a quarter-mile stretch, and a cessation of all hostilities between our ranches. Blackburn's lawyer whispered something in his ear, but Blackburn waved him away impatiently. And if I find these terms unacceptable, then we leave today no better off than we arrived, Harrison said evenly. And you can explain to your men and your cattle why your pride is worth more than their well-being. Blackburn's face flushed with anger. You dare lecture me on pride, Caldwell? After you nearly died rather than sell me that creek. Faith felt tension crackling in the room. Harrison's jaw was tight, his patience clearly wearing thin. Before he could respond, Faith spoke up. Gentlemen, if I may, she interjected, earning surprised looks from everyone present. Mr. Blackburn, this agreement represents a compromise that benefits both parties. Your cattle get the water they desperately need, while Mr. Caldwell retains his property rights. Surely that's preferable to prolonged conflict. Blackburn studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. You found yourself a spirited filly, Caldwell, he remarked finally. I've found myself a partner, Blackburn, Harrison corrected, his voice cold, and you would do well to address her with respect. The older rancher's eyes moved between them, calculation evident in his gaze. At last he leaned back in his chair. 500 is too high, 300. 400, Harrison countered, and access extended to a third of a mile, and so the negotiation began in earnest. For nearly 2 hours, the men haggled over details, with Faith occasionally offering suggestions that helped bridge particularly contentious points. Mr. Winters acted as mediator, while the lawyers documented each agreed-upon term. By mid-afternoon, exhaustion was evident on all faces, but a deal had been struck. Blackburn would have water rights to a specific portion of Silver Creek for $400 annually, with strict provisions to prevent overuse or pollution of the water. As the final document was being prepared for signatures, Blackburn addressed Faith directly for the first time. Miss O'Malley, you have a way of finding middle ground where men see only battle lines. Caldwell is fortunate to have you. Faith inclined her head graciously. Thank you, Mr. Blackburn. I hope this agreement marks the beginning of more peaceful relations between your properties. Blackburn's laugh was short and harsh. Let's not get carried away, miss, but I suppose shooting Caldwell would be bad business now that I'm paying him for water rights. It wasn't exactly a promise of friendship, but it was better than open hostility. Once the documents were signed and witnessed, Harrison rose to shake Blackburn's hand, sealing their agreement with the traditional gesture. As they left the bank, Faith felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the street. We should celebrate, Harrison declared as they mounted their horses. Dinner at the hotel before we return to the ranch. Faith smiled, happiness bubbling up inside her. That sounds lovely. The Kierney Hotel's dining room was the finest establishment in town, with white tablecloths and actual glass windows, a luxury in the territory. Harrison ordered a bottle of champagne, a rare indulgence this far west. To new beginnings, he toasted, raising his glass to Faith. She clinked her glass against his. And to middle ground. As they dined on remarkably tender beefsteak and potatoes, Harrison reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Faith's breath caught in her throat as he placed it on the table between them. I purchased this in Omaha last month before I wrote to you, Harrison explained, his voice uncharacteristically nervous. I wasn't sure when the right moment would be to offer it, but after today, I don't want to wait any longer. With trembling fingers, Faith opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. Harrison, it's beautiful. Faith O'Malley, Harrison said softly, taking her hand in his. "You came west to marry a stranger and ended up saving my life in more ways than one. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife not because of an arrangement or contract, but because I have grown to care for you deeply?" Tears blurred Faith's vision as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Harrison slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her. Around them, other diners had noticed the romantic scene unfolding and broke into applause. As they rode back to the ranch in the gathering dusk, Faith couldn't stop glancing at the ring on her finger, its gold band catching the last rays of sunlight. Beside her, Harrison rode tall and strong, showing little sign of his recent brush with death. "When shall we be married?" she asked as the ranch came into view. Harrison smiled over at her. "As soon as you like. The circuit preacher comes through Kierney every third Sunday. He'll be here in 10 days. 10 days, Faith repeated. That hardly gives us time to prepare. "We could wait longer if you prefer," Harrison offered. "Send for a proper dress from Omaha, perhaps." Faith considered this, then shook her head. "No, I don't want to wait. 10 days is perfect." The next week and a half passed in a flurry of activity. Word spread quickly throughout the county that Harrison Caldwell was to marry his mail-order bride, and preparations for the event took on a life of their own. Mrs. Bell and the other women from neighboring ranches took Faith under their wing, helping her alter one of her better dresses into something suitable for a bride. The men, meanwhile, built tables and benches for the feast that would follow the ceremony. To Faith's surprise, even Victor Blackburn sent a wedding gift, a fine silver tea service delivered by one of his hands with a gruffly worded note of congratulation. "Wonders never cease," Harrison remarked when Faith showed him the gift. The evening before the wedding, as Faith sat on the porch watching the sunset, Harrison joined her, settling into the chair beside hers. "Nervous?" he asked gently. "A little," she admitted. "It all seems to be happening so quickly." Harrison took her hand. "We can still postpone if you have doubts." Faith shook her head. "No doubts, just the usual bridal jitters, I suppose." She turned to face him fully. "Harrison, there's something I've been meaning to ask you." "Anything," he replied. "Why did you send for a bride?" she asked. "You're young, successful, handsome. Surely there were women in the territory who would have been eager to marry you." Harrison was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "There were," he acknowledged finally. "But I wanted someone who hadn't known me as I was building my fortune, someone who wouldn't carry preconceptions or local gossip. And," he hesitated, "my mother was from Boston. I suppose I thought a woman from there might bring something of her spirit to this place." Faith squeezed his hand, touched by the revelation. "Tell me about her." As the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, Harrison spoke of his parents, his Boston-born mother, who had followed his father west with dreams of adventure. His father, who had worked himself to death expanding their small homestead into a viable ranch. Both had died of fever when Harrison was 16, leaving him to make his own way. "They would have liked you," Harrison concluded, "especially my mother. She valued courage and intelligence above all else." "I wish I could have known them," Faith said softly. Harrison brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Tomorrow you'll be a Caldwell. In a way, you'll be carrying on their legacy too." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright. Faith woke early, a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation fluttering in her stomach. Mrs. Bell helped her dress and arranged her hair with wildflowers gathered from the prairie. "You look beautiful, Miss Faith," the older woman declared, stepping back to admire her work. "Mr. Caldwell won't know what hit him." The ceremony was to take place under the large oak tree near the house, where benches had been arranged in rows facing a simple arch decorated with more wildflowers. By mid-morning, guests began to arrive, neighboring ranchers and their families, townspeople from Kierney, and even a few travelers who happened to be passing through. Faith remained sequestered in the house, watching through the window as Harrison greeted guests. He looked magnificent in a new black suit, his hair neatly combed, his face clean-shaven. It was hard to believe that less than a month ago he had been near death on that railway platform. At precisely noon, Frank knocked on Faith's door. "Time, Miss Faith," he announced. "Mr. Caldwell is waiting." Taking a deep breath, Faith descended the stairs and stepped out onto the porch. A hush fell over the gathered crowd as she appeared, and all eyes turned toward her. But Faith saw only Harrison, standing beneath the arch, his face illuminated with joy as she walked toward him. The preacher, a kindly older man with a well-worn Bible, led them through the traditional ceremony. When it came time for the vows, Harrison's voice rang out clear and strong. "I, Harrison Caldwell, take thee, Faith O'Malley, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Faith repeated the sacred words, her heart full to bursting. When Harrison slipped a second gold band onto her finger to join her engagement ring, tears of happiness spilled down her cheeks. "By the power vested in me," the preacher concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Harrison drew Faith into his arms, his lips meeting hers in a tender, heartfelt kiss that promised a lifetime of love and partnership. Around them, the guests erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. Tables groaned under the weight of food and drink. A fiddle player from town provided music for dancing, and everyone agreed it was the finest wedding the county had seen in many years. As the sun began to set, Harrison found Faith sitting at a table, watching the dancers with a contented smile. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, offering his hand. "May I have this dance?" Faith placed her hand in his. "I thought you'd never ask, Mr. Caldwell." As they moved together in the golden light of sunset, Faith marveled at the strange and wonderful turn her life had taken. 1 month ago, she had been a destitute orphan boarding a train to marry a stranger. Now she was the wife of a man she had come to admire and love, the mistress of a prosperous ranch, surrounded by people who had accepted her as their own. "Happy," Harrison murmured close to her ear. "More than I ever thought possible," Faith replied truthfully. Later, as the last guests departed and the ranch hands began clearing away the remnants of the celebration, Harrison swept Faith into his arms. "What are you doing?" she gasped, laughing as he carried her toward the house. "Carrying my bride across the threshold," Harrison replied with a grin. "It's tradition." Inside, the house was quiet and cool after the bustle of the day. Harrison set Faith gently on her feet in the front hall but kept his arms around her waist. "I have something to show you," he said, taking her hand and leading her upstairs. To Faith's surprise, he guided her not to his bedroom, now their bedroom, but to a door at the opposite end of the hall. "Close your eyes," he instructed. Faith complied, her curiosity piqued. She heard the door open, felt Harrison guide her forward a few steps. "Now you can look," he said. Faith opened her eyes to find herself in a beautiful study. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes both practical and literary. A graceful desk stood before a window that offered a view of the prairie, and comfortable chairs were arranged near a small fireplace. "This was my mother's room," Harrison explained. "She used to write letters to her family back east here and read during the long winter evenings." "I thought you might like a space of your own." Faith turned to him, deeply moved by the gesture. "It's perfect, Harrison, thank you." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch tender. "I want you to feel that this is truly your home, Faith. Not just a place you ended up because of circumstance. It already feels like home," she assured him, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "Because you're here." Harrison's arms tightened around her, and his kiss deepened, conveying all the longing and love that had been building between them. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "Perhaps," Faith suggested with newfound boldness, "you should show me to our bedroom now." Harrison's eyes darkened with desire. "As my wife commands." That night, as the moon rose over the Nebraska prairie, Faith and Harrison discovered each other in the most intimate way, their bodies joining as their hearts and lives already had. Afterward, as Faith lay in the circle of Harrison's arms, she felt a profound sense of rightness, of belonging. "I never expected this," Harrison murmured against her hair. "When I sent for a mail-order bride, I hoped for companionship, perhaps eventually affection. I never imagined I would find love." Faith propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "Do you love me, Harrison Caldwell?" His hand cupped her cheek. "With all my heart, Faith Caldwell. From the moment you refused to let me die on that railway platform, I think a part of me began to love you." Faith kissed him softly. "And I love you, my stubborn, honorable, wonderful husband." The days turned to weeks and weeks to months as Faith and Harrison settled into married life. The rhythm of the ranch dictated much of their routine: early mornings, busy days, and peaceful evenings spent together. Faith took to ranch life with surprising ease, her natural intelligence and adaptability serving her well in her new role. By the time autumn painted the prairie in golds and russets, Faith had fully established herself as mistress of the Caldwell Ranch. She managed the household with efficiency, kept the books with meticulous care, and had even begun to learn to ride properly, accompanying Harrison on inspections of the property. Their agreement with Victor Blackburn held, and while the two ranchers would never be friends, a grudging respect had developed between them. The water from Silver Creek sustained Blackburn's cattle through the dry season, and the annual payment bolstered the Caldwells' finances. As winter approached, bringing with it the first snowfall, Faith made a discovery that filled her with both joy and trepidation. After several days of feeling unwell in the mornings, she consulted with Mrs. Bell, whose knowing smile confirmed her suspicions. That evening, as she and Harrison sat before the fire in the parlor, she gathered her courage to share the news. "Harrison," she began, setting aside her sewing, "I have something to tell you." He looked up from his newspaper, immediately alert to the seriousness in her tone. "What is it?" "Are you unwell?" Faith took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "Not unwell, just expecting." Harrison's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "A baby, we're going to have a baby." At Faith's nod, his face broke into a smile of such pure happiness that it brought tears to her eyes. He gathered her into his arms, holding her as though she were made of the most precious porcelain. "When?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Mrs. Bell thinks late spring, perhaps May," Faith replied. "Are you pleased?" "Pleased," Harrison repeated incredulously. "Faith, I'm overjoyed, a child our child." He kissed her tenderly. "You've given me everything I never knew I wanted." The winter of 1867-1868 proved to be one of the harshest in memory, with blizzards sweeping across the plains and temperatures falling to bitter lows. But inside the Caldwell home, warmth and love flourished. As Faith's body changed with the growing life inside her, Harrison's devotion only deepened. He insisted she rest frequently, took on additional household responsibilities, and spent hours planning improvements to the ranch for their expanding family. Spring arrived late that year, the last snowdrifts reluctant to yield to the warming sun. By April, Faith's condition was obvious to all, her belly round beneath her dresses. The women of neighboring ranches and Kierney town brought gifts for the baby: hand-knitted blankets, tiny gowns, and practical advice for the young mother-to-be. On a warm afternoon in early May, as Faith sat in her study writing a letter to an old friend in Boston, the first pains began. She had been expecting them, had been prepared by Mrs. Bell and the midwife from town, but the reality was still startling in its intensity. Harrison was checking the new calves in the south pasture when one of the house servants rode out to fetch him. He returned at a gallop, practically leaping from his horse before it had fully stopped. "Faith," he called as he burst through the door. "Upstairs," Mrs. Bell replied calmly. "And don't you go charging in there like a bull, Mr. Caldwell. These things take time." The labor was long and difficult. Faith endured the pain with the same quiet determination she had shown in all challenges since arriving in Nebraska. Harrison paced the hallway outside their bedroom, flinching at each cry that escaped through the door, praying as he had never prayed before. As twilight settled over the prairie, a new sound filled the Caldwell home, the lusty cry of a newborn. Minutes later, Mrs. Bell opened the bedroom door, her face weary but beaming. "You have a son, Mr. Caldwell," she announced. "A fine, healthy boy." Harrison entered the bedroom on unsteady legs. Faith lay propped against pillows, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion but radiant with joy. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in one of the knitted blankets. "Come meet your son," Faith invited softly. Harrison approached the bed with reverence, gazing down at the tiny red face of his child. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and when he briefly opened his eyes, they were the deep blue of a summer sky. "He's perfect," Harrison whispered, carefully sitting on the edge of the bed. "Just like his mother," Faith smiled tiredly. "I thought we might name him Edward after my father, Edward Harrison Caldwell." Harrison nodded, too overcome to speak. Gently, he took the baby from Faith's arms, cradling him with newfound skill. "Welcome to the world, Edward," he murmured. "You are so very loved." The years that followed brought both challenges and blessings to the Caldwell family. The ranch prospered under Harrison's shrewd management and Faith's careful bookkeeping. Edward grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's features and his mother's quick mind. And in the spring of 1870, the family welcomed a daughter, whom they named Margaret Rose after Harrison's mother. Faith's transformation from Boston orphan to Nebraska rancher's wife was complete. The skills that had seemed so useless in her previous life, her education, her organizational abilities, her social graces proved invaluable in building the Caldwell legacy. She established a small school on the ranch for Edward, Margaret, and the children of their workers. She organized social gatherings that helped forge stronger bonds with neighboring ranchers. And she supported Harrison through the inevitable hardships of Western life droughts, harsh winters, and economic uncertainties. By 1877, 10 years after Faith had first stepped off that train in Kierney, the Caldwell Ranch had become one of the most respected cattle operations in the state of Nebraska. Their herd numbered in the thousands, their lands had expanded, and their home had grown to accommodate their family of 5. Edward had been joined not only by Margaret, but by a younger brother, James, born in 1873. On the anniversary of their meeting, Harrison surprised Faith with a trip east to Boston, where she could show their children the city of her birth and revisit the places of her youth. "Are you sure we can afford the time away?" Faith asked as Harrison presented her with the train tickets. "The ranch won't fall apart in a month," Harrison assured her. "Frank can manage, and the children are old enough to appreciate the journey." It was a magnificent adventure. 9-year-old Edward, 7-year-old Margaret, and 4-year-old James were wide-eyed at the sights and sounds of the eastern cities. Faith found Boston both familiar and strange, the city of her childhood, overlaid with the perspective of a woman who had found her true home on the prairie. They visited Faith's parents' graves, laying flowers and telling the children stories of the grandparents they had never known. They toured the school where Faith had been educated, now much expanded, and the church where she had been baptized. On their final evening in Boston, as they prepared to board the train that would begin their journey home, Harrison took Faith's hand as they stood on the platform. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly, "about leaving all this behind?" Faith looked around at the bustling station, the well-dressed crowds, the trappings of Eastern civilization. Then she looked at her family, her handsome husband, now showing touches of silver at his temples but still strong and vital, her children, tanned from prairie sun and sturdy from ranch life, their eyes bright with intelligence and curiosity. "Not a single one," she replied with complete certainty. "That train I boarded 10 years ago didn't just take me west, Harrison. It took me home." Harrison's arm slipped around her waist, drawing her close. And to think it all began because a mail-order bride found a dying cowboy at a station and refused to let him go. Faith leaned into his embrace, remembering that fateful day with perfect clarity. "You're coming with me," she had told him, determined and afraid but unwilling to abandon him. It had been the first decisive act of her new life, the moment when Faith O'Malley began to discover her own strength. "It was the best decision I ever made," she said, rising on tiptoe to kiss him as their train pulled into the station. "Taking you home." As the Caldwell family boarded the train that would carry them back to Nebraska, back to the ranch, and the life they had built together, Faith knew with absolute certainty that some journeys were meant to be, that some strangers were destined to become the great loves of our lives, if only we have the courage to claim them. The dying cowboy and his mail-order bride had defied the odds, transforming a business arrangement into a love story that would be told in their family for generations to come. And as the train pulled away from Boston, carrying them westward toward home, Faith silently thanked whatever providence had placed her on that platform in Kierney on that fateful day 10 years before. "Ready to go home?" Harrison asked, settling their youngest on his lap as the train gathered speed. Faith smiled, watching the city recede through the window. "I'm already there," she replied. "Wherever you and the children are, that's home." And as the eastern landscape gave way to the vast heartland of America, Faith Caldwell closed her eyes, content in the knowledge that the greatest adventure of her life had begun with 6 simple words spoken to a stranger. "You're coming with me, Mr. Caldwell." It was a promise she had kept, a journey they had taken together, and a love that had saved them both.